In an era where power and family intertwined with the destinies of nations, one of the most dramatic stories of betrayal ever recorded emerges. Imagine a prince of such extraordinary beauty that his hair, cut only once a year due to its weight, was worth 200 shekels by the royal scale, approximately 2.3 kilograms of pure gold. This was Absalom, the third son of King David, whose dazzling appearance concealed boundless ambition. The Bible presents not merely a political conflict, but a family tragedy that echoes through the centuries. How could a man betray his own father, the greatest king Israel had ever known? What deep wounds could transform a beloved prince into a relentless usurper? And why, even after such betrayal, would a father weep inconsolably over the death of the son who sought to destroy him? Absalom's story is a mirror of human complexities, beauty and vanity, justice and vengeance, paternal love and unbridled ambition. While the books of Samuel narrate these events with surprising frankness, they reveal the devastating consequences when extraordinary talents are not matched by character. Prepare yourself for a journey through the corridors of power in ancient Israel, where we will witness the unfolding of a meticulously planned conspiracy that divided a nation. A narrative where the sword prophesied by Nathan shall never depart from the house of David fulfills its most painful purpose, turning the royal palace into a stage of intrigue, betrayal, and a lament that would echo through the valleys of Jerusalem. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom! Would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son." In the early years of David's reign, while he ruled in Hebron before conquering Jerusalem, Absalom was born, his third son. His mother was Maacah, a foreign princess, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur, one of the political alliances David formed through marriages. From a young age, Absalom drew attention wherever he went. The scriptures repeatedly mention his extraordinary physical beauty, a rare attribute even among the king's children. What impressed everyone the most, however, was his hair. So abundant and heavy that Absalom needed to cut it only once a year when the weight became unbearable. When cut, his hair weighed about 200 shekels by the royal scale, approximately 2.5 kilograms, a detail the Bible records with precision, highlighting how remarkable this trait was. This physical beauty would later become both his distinctive mark and part of his downfall. Among his many brothers and sisters, Absalom had a special bond with his sister Tamar, who shared with him the same extraordinary beauty inherited from their mother, Maacah. The two were full siblings, children of the same parents, and Absalom nurtured a special affection and protection for Tamar, something that would be put to the test in the events that followed. The tragedy that would forever change Absalom's fate began with his half-brother Amnon, David's firstborn, born of another wife. Amnon developed a sick obsession for Tamar, consumed by impure desires for his own half-sister. So intense was this passion that Amnon became ill, wasting away day by day as he thought of Tamar. Jonadab, Amnon's cousin and a cunning man, noticing the prince's suffering, asked him the cause. Upon learning of the forbidden desire, instead of dissuading him, Jonadab offered a wicked plan. He advised Amnon to pretend to be ill, and when the king came to visit him, to ask that Tamar be sent to prepare food and serve him personally in his chambers. The plan worked exactly as intended. David, concerned for his firstborn's health, sent Tamar to care for the sick brother. She, innocent and obedient, went to Amnon's chambers and prepared special cakes for him, as requested. But when she attempted to serve them, Amnon ordered all the servants to leave, leaving them completely alone. It was then that Amnon's true intentions were revealed. He grabbed Tamar and demanded that she lie with him. Faced with her refusal and desperate pleas, which even included a proposal that Amnon ask David for her hand in marriage, an unlikely solution but demonstrating her desperation, Amnon did not hold back. Being stronger, he violated Tamar, completely disgracing her according to the standards of Israeli society. What followed was even more disturbing. After satisfying his desire, Amnon was overcome with a hatred even greater than the passion he had felt before. He ordered Tamar to leave his chambers immediately, further increasing her humiliation. When she refused, arguing that expelling her would be an even greater offense than the violence already committed, Amnon called his servant and commanded him to throw her out, locking the door behind her. Devastated, Tamar tore her princess tunic, covered her head with ashes as a sign of mourning, and walked through the city crying out, her hands on her head in despair. Her destination was Absalom's house, her full brother, the only place where she could find refuge in her disgrace. There she remained, living as a desolate woman, with her future and honor destroyed by Amnon's cruel act. When Absalom found Tamar in such a state and learned of what had happened, his first advice was surprisingly restrained. "Keep quiet, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this thing to heart." Words that might sound indifferent but concealed a calculated fury. Absalom took Tamar into his house, where she began to live in seclusion as a woman whose life had been ruined. King David, upon hearing of the terrible event, was furious. However, the scriptures note a crucial omission. David did not punish Amnon for the crime, perhaps because he was his firstborn, perhaps because his own moral failings with Bathsheba still weighed on his conscience, or perhaps due to the political complexity of the situation. David did not act with the justice the situation demanded. In the face of the king's inaction, Absalom took upon himself the role of protector and avenger of his sister. Interestingly, he did not act immediately. For 2 full years, Absalom remained silent on the matter. He did not say a single word to Amnon, neither good nor bad. This silence was not forgiveness, but rather the perfect mask for a hatred that grew day by day as he meticulously planned his revenge. Absalom's patience was calculated. He knew that an immediate attack would raise suspicions and could be thwarted. By allowing time to pass, he made the court lower its guard, believing that the matter had been forgotten or forgiven. Meanwhile, every detail of his revenge was carefully crafted, waiting only for the perfect moment to be executed. The opportunity Absalom had been waiting for arose with the traditional sheep-shearing festival in Baal Hazor, Absalom's estate near the border of Ephraim. Shearing was traditionally an occasion of celebration and feasting for shepherds and owners, a time of joy after the labor of wool harvesting. Absalom planned a grand banquet and with cunning diplomacy approached David to invite him. "Your servant is having his sheep sheared. Let the king and his servants come with your servant." It was an invitation that demonstrated apparent reconciliation and respect for David's paternal and royal figure. The king, probably suspicious of Absalom's intentions, or simply not wanting to burden his son with the expense of hosting the entire court, declined the invitation. "No, my son, we will not all go, so as not to be a burden to you." When Absalom insisted, David maintained his refusal, but offered his blessing for the event. It was then that Absalom made the crucial request, revealing his true objective. "If you won't come yourself, at least let my brother Amnon come with us." David questioned the necessity of Amnon's specific presence, perhaps sensing that something was not right. However, faced with Absalom's insistence, he relented and allowed not only Amnon, but all the king's sons to attend the banquet. With all preparations made and Amnon's presence secured, Absalom gathered his servants and gave them specific instructions. "Watch closely. When Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and I say, 'Strike Amnon,' then kill him. Do not fear, for I have commanded you. Be strong and courageous." The banquet proceeded as planned. Abundant food, plenty of wine, and the princes of Israel relaxed, celebrating the shearing. Amnon, as Absalom had anticipated, drank excessively, becoming vulnerable and slow to react. When the moment seemed right, Absalom gave the prearranged signal. His servants, obedient to their instructions, moved against Amnon and killed him there in front of all the king's sons. The festive banquet instantly turned into a scene of horror and panic. The other princes, fearing they might be next, immediately rose, mounted their mules, and fled at full speed, returning to Jerusalem to seek the king's protection. The chaos following the murder was amplified by rumors that spread quickly. Before the fleeing princes even reached Jerusalem, a messenger arrived ahead and brought David news that was even more terrible than the reality. Absalom has killed all the king's sons. Not one of them is left. David, devastated by the news, tore his garments and threw himself to the ground, while all his servants around him did the same, their clothes also torn, as a sign of extreme mourning. The entire court plunged into despair, imagining an unprecedented calamity, the extermination of the entire royal lineage, a blow from which the kingdom might not recover. It was Jonadab, the same cousin who had advised Amnon in his plan to violate. Tamar, who brought some clarity to the situation. With remarkable composure, he said to David, "Do not think, my lord the king, that all the young princes have been killed. Only Amnon is dead. This has been determined by Absalom since the day Amnon humiliated his sister Tamar." Meanwhile, Absalom wasted no time. Knowing that his act would bring immediate consequences, he fled right after the banquet. His destination was carefully chosen: Geshur, the kingdom ruled by his maternal grandfather Talmai. There, beyond Israel's borders and protected by family ties, Absalom found a safe refuge from David's wrath and from Israelite laws. In Geshur, Absalom remained for 3 full years. During this time, he was physically safe but separated from everything he knew: his country, his position as a prince, and his family. This forced exile gave him time to reflect, but it also allowed bitterness and resentment to grow in his heart. He was far from David's eyes, but never completely forgotten. In Jerusalem, David sank into deep mourning over Amnon's death. As a father, he bitterly wept for the loss of his firstborn, despite his son's moral failings. As a king, he had to deal with the political reality of a prince murdering another and the dangerous precedent this set for the kingdom. But time, as always, exerted its softening effect. Gradually, the pain of losing Amnon diminished, and David's heart began to long for Absalom. Though he had committed a grave crime, he was still David's son, and the king began to consider the possibility of reconciliation. Joab, the army general and David's nephew, was a keen observer of the king's emotions. Sensing that David's heart was inclining toward Absalom, he decided to intervene to facilitate a reconciliation that, in his view, would be beneficial for the kingdom's stability. With ingenious strategy, Joab brought a woman from Tekoa, known for her wisdom. He carefully instructed her to present herself to David as a mourning widow with a specific story to tell, a parable that, without David realizing it initially, mirrored his own situation with Absalom. The woman told David that she had 2 sons, who had fought in the field with no one to separate them. One killed the other, and now the entire family demanded that she hand over the surviving son to be executed for the crime. She pleaded for the king's protection, arguing that if her remaining son were killed, it would completely extinguish her family line. David, moved by her story, promised to protect the woman's son. Then, skillfully, she turned the argument against the king himself. Why then do you think differently against the people of God? By saying this, the king condemns himself, for he does not bring back the one he has banished. Confronted with his own inconsistency, David realized that the woman had been sent by Joab. Recognizing the wisdom of the stratagem, and perhaps relieved to have a justification for doing what his heart already desired, David sent Joab to bring Absalom back to Jerusalem. However, the reconciliation would be only partial. David set a clear condition: let him go to his own house, but he must not see my face. Thus, after 3 years of exile, Absalom returned to Jerusalem, but was not permitted to enter the presence of the king, his father. It was a clear sign that although he was back, he had not been completely forgiven. Absalom returned to Jerusalem, but his situation was far from what he desired. For 2 full years, he lived in the city as a prince without privileges. He lived in his own house, but was forbidden from seeing his father's face, King David. He could not frequent the royal palace, participate in councils, or hold any official position as a prince of Israel. This ambiguous position was particularly difficult to bear. He was no longer in exile, but neither was he fully reintegrated. He was not a common criminal, but he also did not enjoy the rights of his royal position. He was not fully punished, as he had been allowed to return, but he was not forgiven either, as the prohibition against seeing the king remained. This situation fueled the bitterness that was already growing in Absalom's heart. It was a constant humiliation for someone of his pride and position. Each day that passed without being able to exert his influence as a prince or receive his father's public recognition increased his resentment. After enduring this situation for 2 years, Absalom decided it was time to act to change his status. He tried to contact Joab, who had mediated his return, hoping he could once again intervene with the king. He sent messengers summoning Joab for a conversation, but the general, perhaps sensing trouble, refused to come. A second attempt had the same result. Joab simply ignored Absalom's calls. Frustrated by this refusal and determined to be heard, Absalom resorted to a drastic tactic. He called his servants and ordered, "See, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire." The servants, loyal to their master's orders, went and set Joab's barley field ablaze. The strategy, though extreme, worked. The damage to his property finally brought Joab to Absalom, albeit furious. When questioned about the reason for such an act, Absalom was direct. "I sent word for you to come here so I could send you to the king with a message. Why did I return from Geshur? It would have been better for me to stay there. Now I want to see the king's face, and if there is iniquity in me, let him put me to death." Absalom's outburst revealed his desperation. He preferred even death to continuing to live in that social and political limbo. Joab, understanding the gravity of the situation, agreed to take the message to David. After the incident with the burned field, Joab kept his promise and spoke to David about Absalom's situation. He conveyed not only the request, but also the growing frustration of his son. Perhaps he argued that keeping Absalom in that undefined position was harmful both to him and to the stability of the kingdom. David finally agreed to receive his son. He sent a formal summons, and Absalom presented himself at the palace for the long-awaited audience with the king. The moment was fraught with tension and repressed emotion. Father and son face to face after years of separation, with the weight of unresolved family traumas between them. Following royal protocol and demonstrating submission, Absalom prostrated himself with his face to the ground before the king. David, moved by the paternal love that had never truly disappeared, made a significant gesture. He leaned down and kissed his son. It was the formal sign of reconciliation, the public indication that Absalom was forgiven and readmitted into the royal family. However, this kiss, while symbolically important, was not accompanied by a true rebuilding of the relationship. There were no deep conversations about the events that led to the exile, nor about Absalom's feelings regarding his sister's rape and David's initial inaction. The murder of Amnon, although formally forgiven, remained an unspoken shadow between them. Absalom was readmitted to court and regained his official status as a prince. He could once again move freely through the palace, participate in royal ceremonies, and perform functions consistent with his position. To all outward appearances, the family crisis had been resolved and order was restored. But beneath the surface of this formal reconciliation, emotional wounds remained open. The trust between father and son was fundamentally broken. David likely still feared Absalom's temperament and questioned his judgment. Absalom, in turn, harbored resentments not only for the years of exile and humiliation, but also for the lack of justice for Tamar. This reconciliation of appearances, without a true restoration of trust and affection, did not satisfy Absalom's emotional needs. On the contrary, it may have only solidified his conviction that he would never receive from David the recognition and respect he believed he deserved. It was in this fertile ground of disappointments and frustrated ambitions that bolder ideas began to sprout. If he could not obtain what he desired as a son, perhaps he could conquer it by other means. Once reinstated at the court, Absalom wasted no time in revealing his new ambitions. With calculated deliberation, he began to build an image that rivaled that of the king himself. He acquired chariots and horses, symbols of power and wealth rarely seen in Israel at that time. Complementing this royal display, he recruited 50 men to run ahead of his chariot, an ostentatious demonstration of status that announced his passage and demanded recognition from all. This display was not mere vanity, but part of a strategy to visually establish himself as an alternative figure of authority to David. In the public imagination, Absalom began to look and act like a king, deliberately cultivating this association. But Absalom's strategy went far beyond external symbols of power. With political astuteness, he identified a vulnerability in his father's reign: the administration of justice. David, preoccupied with wars, diplomacy, and the vast administration of the kingdom, could not personally attend to all the legal disputes that reached the royal court. Absalom began to rise early every morning and position himself by the city gate, the traditional place where judges sat to resolve disputes and where people came seeking justice. There, he intercepted anyone coming with a legal case. "Where are you from?" he would ask, showing personal interest in each matter. When the person explained their situation and the dispute they hoped to resolve, Absalom listened with apparent empathy, nodding in understanding. After listening attentively, he would offer his assessment. "Look, your claims are good and right, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." This remark was carefully constructed to suggest a flaw in David's government without openly criticizing him. Absalom would then add, "Oh, if only I were appointed judge in the land. Then everyone who had a complaint or case could come to me, and I would see that they receive justice." With these words, he planted a seductive idea in the minds of the Israelites: the vision of a ruler more accessible, more concerned with the common people, more dedicated to the everyday justice that affected their lives. Without ever openly declaring opposition to David, he was gradually undermining public confidence in his government and presenting himself as an alternative. Absalom's strategy to gain popular support went beyond words and promises. He deeply understood the importance of symbolic gestures and personal contact in building political loyalty. When someone approached to bow before him, acknowledging his status as a prince, Absalom would extend his hand, lift the person up, and kiss them. This gesture radically broke traditional royal protocol, which maintained a distance between royalty and common people. By refusing formal reverence and replacing it with warm personal contact, Absalom conveyed a powerful message. He did not consider himself above the people, but a part of them. His extraordinary physical beauty, repeatedly mentioned in Scripture, functioned as a political asset. In an era that associated physical beauty with divine blessing and leadership aptitude, his impressive appearance naturally inspired admiration and predisposed people to view him favorably. Absalom understood this effect and carefully cultivated his image, knowing that his mere presence left a lasting impression. For a full 4 years, Absalom methodically worked on this campaign to win the hearts of the Israelites. Day after day, case after case, kiss after kiss, each interaction was a small seed planted that over time would grow into an unprecedented movement of popular support. Absalom's strategy was particularly effective because it directly contrasted with David's growing inaccessibility. The king, aging and absorbed by the complex affairs of state and the demands of managing an expanding kingdom, became increasingly distant from ordinary people. The same responsibilities that made David a powerful king also distanced him from direct contact with his subjects, a vulnerability that Absalom skillfully exploited. Absalom's man of the people approach, his apparent concern for everyday justice, his accessibility and personal charisma gradually created a base of popular support that transcended tribal and social class boundaries. Without ever openly declaring rebellion or directly criticizing his father, Absalom was effectively building an alternative political movement within the kingdom. And as his popularity grew, so did his confidence. What may have started as a quest for recognition and respect transformed over the years into a greater ambition. Absalom did not merely want to be heard or respected, he wanted to rule. The throne his father occupied began to seem not only desirable, but achievable. After 4 years of meticulous preparation and building popular support, Absalom felt the time for decisive action had arrived. His strategy to seize power needed to begin outside Jerusalem, away from the watchful eyes of the royal guard and David's loyal advisors. With the cunning that characterized him, Absalom approached his father with an apparently innocent and pious request. "Please let me go to Hebron to fulfill a vow I made to the Lord. For while your servant was living at Geshur in Aram, I made a vow saying, if the Lord indeed brings me back to Jerusalem, I will serve the Lord with sacrifices." The choice of Hebron was no accident. This city held deep historical and emotional significance for Israel and for the house of David. It was in Hebron that David was first anointed king over Judah and where he reigned for 7 years before conquering Jerusalem. It was a place with historical legitimacy for royal beginnings. Absalom himself had been born there during his father's initial reign. David, unsuspecting of his son's true intentions, granted permission for the journey. He may have even seen the gesture as a positive sign of Absalom's religious commitment, an indication of spiritual maturity and gratitude to God for his return from exile. But while preparing his departure for Hebron, Absalom simultaneously set a much broader and bolder plan into motion. He sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, instructing strategically placed supporters, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, then say, 'Absalom reigns in Hebron.'" This careful coordination would ensure that, when the moment arrived, the announcement of his ascension to the throne would be amplified throughout the country, creating the impression of a spontaneous national movement rather than an isolated rebellion. The psychological effect would be powerful. For many Israelites, it would seem as if the entire country was declaring loyalty to Absalom simultaneously, generating a sense of inevitability and momentum. With these preparations underway, Absalom set out for Hebron, accompanied by 200 men from Jerusalem. Significantly, the scriptures mention that these men went in their simplicity, knowing nothing of the real plan. They were likely respectable figures of Jerusalemite society, whose presence would lend legitimacy to the endeavor, even though they were unaware of the role they would play in the rebellion. In Hebron, Absalom offered sacrifices, outwardly fulfilling the religious vow he had claimed. This public display of piety served both to maintain his facade before those unaware of his plans and to suggest divine approval for his subsequent actions. Among all the measures Absalom took to strengthen his rebellion, perhaps none was as strategically significant as securing the support of Ahithophel the Gilonite. As David's chief counselor, Ahithophel was revered for his extraordinary wisdom. The scriptures highlight that the counsel of Ahithophel, which he counseled in those days, was as if a man had inquired at the oracle of God, an indication of this man's nearly infallible political and strategic insight. While offering sacrifices in Hebron, Absalom sent specific messengers to Gilo, Ahithophel's hometown, inviting him to join the conspiracy. To the surprise and dismay of many, Ahithophel accepted the invitation, abandoning his position with David to align with the rebellious son. This betrayal was not a momentary impulse, but likely the result of grievances cultivated over years. Although the scriptures do not directly explain Ahithophel's motivations, a crucial family connection provides revealing context. Ahithophel was Bathsheba's grandfather, the woman whom David took after orchestrating the death of her husband, Uriah. Even after David officially married Bathsheba and brought her son Solomon into the royal family, the stain of the original dishonor remained. For a man of honor like Ahithophel, such offenses could not simply be forgotten. Ahithophel's adherence to Absalom's cause represented a devastating blow to David. It was not merely the loss of a brilliant counselor, but the gain of this same intellect by the opposition. Ahithophel knew intimately David's strengths and weaknesses, his mindset, strategies, and the secrets of his administration. All this knowledge would now serve Absalom. When David learned of this specific betrayal, he immediately recognized its gravity. His reaction was an urgent prayer. "O Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness." This prayer reveals how much David feared the strategic influence of his former counselor. He knew that Ahithophel's advice, if followed precisely, could secure the rebellion's success. The conspiracy quickly gained strength in Hebron, with Ahithophel at his side, legitimizing his claims with his respected presence. More and more people joined Absalom's cause. What had begun as a faction now took on the characteristics of a national movement, with supporters from various tribes declaring loyalty to the new aspirant to the throne. For many ordinary Israelites, confused by the rapid political changes, the presence of respected figures like Ahithophel alongside Absalom signaled that this was not a common or illegitimate rebellion, but a power transition with a solid foundation. If wise and pious men supported Absalom, they reasoned, perhaps there was justification for his ascension. The crucial moment finally arrived. In Hebron, a city of historical significance where David had been crowned king over Judah decades earlier, Absalom was officially anointed king by his followers. The ceremony, although not conducted by the official temple priests, followed traditional Israelite royal anointing rituals, creating a powerful image of legitimacy. As planned, at the sound of the trumpets announcing the anointing, messengers and supporters throughout Israel simultaneously proclaimed, "Absalom reigns in Hebron." The news spread like wildfire throughout the nation, creating precisely the effect Absalom had calculated, a sense of irresistible national movement, as if all Israel were willingly transferring their loyalty to the new king. The psychology of this strategy was brilliant. For many distant communities receiving the news, it seemed as though Absalom had already firmly established his kingdom, and that resistance would not only be futile, but contrary to the apparent collective will of the people. This perception further encouraged more people to publicly declare support for the usurper, creating a cycle of growing momentum. Crowds began to flock to Hebron, wanting to be present at what seemed to be the birth of a new era. The biblical text specifically notes that the conspiracy grew strong, and the people with Absalom continually increased. Among these supporters were both fervent followers and those who simply went along with the tide, not fully understanding the implications of their actions. The popularity Absalom had methodically cultivated over the years was now bearing fruit. His investment in personal connections, listening to the people's grievances, and presenting himself as a more accessible and just ruler was transforming into tangible political capital. People he had personally consoled or helped became his voluntary ambassadors, spreading his cause within their communities. The plan that Absalom had meticulously prepared for years was now entering its final phase with surprising precision and effectiveness. Every component, the historic location in Hebron, the presence of respectable figures, the coordinated announcement, throughout Israel, the participation of Ahithophel contributed to creating an image of legitimacy and inevitability for his ascension. The rebellion was officially underway, and its initial success exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. The next step was clear: march on Jerusalem, take the capital, the palace, and the symbols of royal power, definitively consolidating his position as the new king of Israel. With every passing hour, more supporters joined his cause, strengthening the army that would soon advance on the city of David. In Jerusalem, meanwhile, the news of Absalom's proclamation as king caused shock and confusion. David's loyalists wondered how such a serious threat had developed almost without warning. What initially seemed like a disturbing rumor was soon confirmed as an alarming reality. Absalom was not only gathering support, he had already been proclaimed king and was marching on the capital with a growing force of followers. For David, the speed with which his son had mobilized national support must have been especially painful. The kingdom he had built with decades of military, political, and spiritual leadership now seemed to turn against him almost overnight. The betrayal came not only from his own son, but from close advisors like Ahithophel and countless ordinary Israelites whom he had governed for so many years. The meticulously planned conspiracy had achieved its first major objective. Absalom had managed to establish himself as a legitimate alternative to David, gained the support of influential figures, and mobilized a significant popular base. What had started as personal resentment and familial ambition had transformed into a national conflict that threatened to divide the kingdom and erase David's legacy. But the following events would show that proclaiming oneself king was only the beginning of the journey. Maintaining the power he had gained would require not only popularity and support, but also strategic wisdom and balanced judgment, qualities that would be severely tested in the days to come. Upon receiving the news of Absalom's rebellion, David reacted swiftly. "Arise and let us flee, lest we escape from Absalom," he said to his servants. Rather than defending Jerusalem and risking a destructive siege for the population, the king decided to depart, demonstrating both military strategy and compassion for the city's inhabitants. David left Jerusalem as a fugitive, crossing the Kidron Valley toward the eastern wilderness, accompanied by his royal household, his warriors, and the servants who remained faithful. He walked barefoot, with his head covered in mourning, while a crowd of people watched his departure, weeping aloud at the humiliation of the great king. He left behind 10 concubines to care for the palace, a decision that would later have painful consequences as events unfolded. The crisis of the rebellion clearly revealed who was truly loyal to David and who was not. Among those who demonstrated extraordinary loyalty was Ittai the Gittite, commander of 600 foreign soldiers. When David suggested that he remain in Jerusalem because he was a foreigner, Ittai responded, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king may be, whether it means life or death, there will your servant be." The priests Zadok and Abiathar attempted to take the Ark of the Covenant with David, but the king ordered them to return it to the city. "Take the Ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back," This decision showed David's deep spirituality, as even in crisis, he did not attempt to use sacred symbols for his own benefit. Strategically, David also established a spy system. The priests would remain in Jerusalem gathering information, and their sons, Ahimaaz and Jonathan, would serve as messengers. Hushai, his friend and advisor, was sent back to the city to infiltrate Absalom's circle and thwart Ahithophel's counsel. During the escape, Ziba, Mephibosheth's servant, brought supplies to the fugitives but also slandered his master, claiming that Mephibosheth hoped to reclaim Saul's kingdom amid the chaos. David, without verifying this information, hastily granted Ziba all of Mephibosheth's properties. One of the most humiliating moments of the flight occurred in Bahurim, when Shimei, from Saul's family, appeared to publicly curse the king. Get out, you murderer!" he shouted while throwing stones at David and his officials. "The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul." Abishai, outraged, asked for permission to kill Shimei. "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head." Surprisingly, David stopped him. "Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. Who can ask, 'Why do you do this?'" This reaction revealed a David transformed by adversity, accepting humiliation as a possible instrument of divine discipline. "It may be that the Lord will see my distress and repay me with good for the cursing I am receiving today," he added, showing rare humility for a monarch. While David fled, Absalom entered Jerusalem victoriously, taking the city without resistance. Among those who welcomed him was Hushai, who pretended to have abandoned David. "Long live the king! Long live the king!" When questioned about this apparent betrayal, Hushai responded ambiguously, "The one chosen by the Lord, by these people, and by all the men of Israel, his I will be, and I will remain with him." One of Absalom's first actions followed Ahithophel's advice. "Go into your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious to your father, and the hands of everyone with you will be strengthened." Following this guidance, Absalom had a tent set up on the palace roof, and in full view of all Israel, he took the concubines that David had left behind. This public act made the rupture between father and son absolutely irreversible. Ironically, this action fulfilled the prophecy that Nathan had made to David after his sin with Bathsheba. "I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, who will sleep with them in broad daylight." With Jerusalem under his control, Absalom faced his first major strategic decision: how to deal with the fugitive David. Ahithophel proposed a bold and effective plan. "Let me choose 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue David tonight. I will attack him while he is tired and weak and will terrify him. I will strike down only the king." Absalom, impressed, also sought Hushai's opinion. Recognizing the opportunity to help David, Hushai cleverly argued against Ahithophel's plan. "You know your father and his men. They are mighty warriors. Your father is a man of war and will not spend the night with the people." Instead of an immediate attack, Hushai suggested gathering a massive army. "Let all Israel be gathered to you from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand by the sea, and you yourself march into battle." This image of leading a vast army appealed to Absalom's vanity. "The advice of Hushai is better than that of Ahithophel," declared Absalom and the elders, inadvertently choosing the plan that favored David. The biblical narrator explains, "For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom." Ahithophel, realizing that the rebellion was doomed by this strategic error, returned to his city, put his house in order, and hanged himself. Hushai immediately sent messengers to David, warning him to cross the Jordan without delay. "Do not spend the night in the wilderness. Cross over, lest the king and all the people with him be swallowed up." David and his followers crossed the Jordan and established themselves in Mahanaim, a fortified city east of the river. There, he received unexpected help from three regional leaders, Shobi, an Ammonite, Machir, and Barzillai, Gileadites, who brought abundant provisions to sustain his army. With his forces replenished, David organized his army into three divisions, commanded by Joab, Abishai, and Ittai. When he announced his intention to personally lead the troops into battle, his commanders objected, "You are worth 10,000 of us. It is better if you support us from the city." David accepted the advice, but made a public request that revealed his internal conflict between royal duty and paternal feelings. "Deal gently with the young man Absalom, for my sake." This order, given in front of everyone, would put his generals in an extremely difficult position during the battle. Absalom's army finally crossed the Jordan in pursuit of David's forces. The armies met in the forest of Ephraim, a rugged terrain that favored David's experienced warriors. The battle was decisive. The people of Israel were defeated by David's servants, and there was a great slaughter that day, 20,000 men. The text adds, "The battle spread over the whole countryside, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword." The difficult terrain became a deadly trap for Absalom's inexperienced troops. During the battle, Absalom, riding his mule, passed under the intertwined branches of a large oak. His abundant hair, his pride and distinctive feature, got caught in the branches. The mule kept going, leaving him suspended between heaven and earth, a symbolic image of his fate suspended between earthly ambitions and divine judgment. A soldier saw Absalom hanging and informed Joab. When questioned why he had not killed him, he replied, "Even if I were given 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. We heard the king order, 'Beware, do not touch the young man Absalom.'" Joab faced the dilemma between personal loyalty and military duty. Deciding for the strategic good of the kingdom, he took 3 javelins and thrust them into Absalom's heart. Then 10 young armor-bearers surrounded the prince and struck him until he died. After confirming his death, Joab blew the trumpet, signaling the end of the combat. David's troops halted the pursuit of the defeated army, allowing the survivors to return to their homes. Absalom's body was thrown into a large pit in the forest, over which they heaped a mound of stones, an anonymous burial that contrasted with the monuments he had built in life to preserve his name. The narrator mentions that Absalom had erected a monument in the Valley of the King, saying, "I have no son to carry on the memory of my name." A tragic irony for someone who valued appearance and legacy so much. The news of the victory needed to reach David quickly. Ahimaaz, the son of the priest Zadok, volunteered to run with the message, but Joab initially sent a Cushite messenger, reluctant to let the priest's son deliver the news of Absalom's death. When Ahimaaz insisted, Joab allowed him to run as well. Being faster, Ahimaaz reached Mahanaim first. Anxious, David immediately asked, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Ahimaaz, hesitant to deliver the full news, vaguely replied that he had seen a commotion but did not know what had happened. Shortly after, the Cushite arrived, and David repeated the question, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" The messenger replied, "May the enemies of my lord the king, and all who rise up to harm you, be like that young man." Realizing that his son was dead, David was overwhelmed by grief. He went up to the room over the city gate and wept, uttering one of the most poignant laments in the Bible. "My son Absalom, my son Absalom. If only I had died instead of you. Absalom, my son, my son." The victory turned to mourning for the entire army. The soldiers who had risked their lives for the king entered the city stealthily, like people ashamed who flee from battle. While David, with his face covered, continued to cry out, "Absalom, my son, Absalom." Joab, recognizing the danger of this situation for the morale of the troops, confronted the king harshly. "Today you have shamed the faces of all your servants who saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters. You love those who hate you and hate those who love you. Today you have shown that captains and servants mean nothing to you, for now I understand that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead, then you would be pleased." This harsh rebuke brought David back to the reality of his responsibilities as king. He composed himself, sat at the city gate, and received his victorious people, initiating the difficult process of national reconciliation after the rebellion. The story of Absalom, his rebellion, and his premature death remains one of the most tragic narratives of the Bible, a tale of ambition, beauty, betrayal, and a father's unconditional love, even for the son who sought to destroy him. The narrative prompts us to reflect on how talents and gifts, when not accompanied by character and humility, can become instruments of our own downfall. Absalom had everything to become a great leader, but he allowed bitterness, pride, and unbridled ambition to corrupt his potential. At the same time, David's inconsolable lament reveals to us the dimension of paternal love that transcends even the worst betrayals. "My son Absalom, my son, if only I had died in your place." These words deeply touch our hearts, reminding us of the love that God the Father has for each of us, even when we rebel and follow our own paths. If this story touched your heart and brought new perspectives on the scriptures, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to our channel to receive more biblical stories presented with depth and historical context, helping you see beyond the surface of these ancient texts. Share this video with friends and family who need to learn these powerful lessons about ambition, forgiveness, and unconditional love. Every share helps our mission to bring God's word to more people in an accessible and impactful way. Leave your own comment telling us which aspect of this story touched you the most, or which other biblical stories you would like to see on our channel. Your suggestions are valuable for us to continue bringing relevant content to your spiritual life until our next encounter with the scriptures. May the story of Absalom and David inspire us to cultivate humility, forgiveness, and true love in our own families and relationships.